We are on 3A-2. This is theme 2 of Unit 3A2. And we need to understand Lincoln, and we need to understand his political opponent. Remember the causes of the Civil War. The South was arguing that they were fighting for states' rights, and they were also fighting to preserve their economic slavery system. But because the Confederates were trying to paint with this states' rights brush, they had to have a constitution that reaffirmed states' rights. And the states wanted to have this right to disregard acts of the central government. And if you remember going back to the Articles of Confederation, it didn't really work out then. And it's going to have just as big of an issue here in the Civil War. The Confederate President Jefferson Davis could not get the Confederate states to effectively work together. This, by the way, is Jefferson Davis. The states all had different goals. They all had different desires, and they had a very difficult time all pushing in the same direction. And eventually Jefferson Davis actually gave up. He decided to go out to the battlefield and try to be a general, and he failed miserably at that. Lincoln's greatest achievement as the leader of the Union was keeping the public supporting the war, even though there was many early military defeats. He used the preserving the Union argument. He said that his goal was neither to end slavery nor to preserve slavery, but it was to keep the Union together one way or the other, which is why he waited to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, why he waited to free the slaves. He made this a goal to free the slaves. Or, I'm sorry, to keep the Union together, not to free the slaves. Which is why we say we can't understand Southern secession without the prism of slavery. The argument takes the form of states' rights. Lincoln had to counteract that argument by making the goal of the war initially preservation of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. This is to counteract the Southern states' rights argument. The states had argued that they had a legal right to leave the Union because the states had agreed to join the Constitution, and that they could leave whenever they wanted to. This is a contractual argument. The states had signed a contract with the central government, and they could leave and they could follow whatever rules they wanted. Lincoln disagreed with that, saying that it was a government made by we the people, not by the states. Lincoln was able to convince the Union that preserving the Union was all important. This opens Lincoln to the charge that he was a racist, which is dubious at best. He was by no means an abolitionist, but we have many primary source evidence that suggests that he wanted to end slavery. Remember, this is 1860, and while he probably didn't believe in the social equality of African Americans, it is quite evident that he wanted at least to have equality under the law. This is a fairly progressive stance in the 1860s, in that point in history. So we need to remember that we're judging not by modern standards, but by the 1860s standards. It's another lesson, actually, in the analysis of documents, and to remember to read the whole source. This is a letter from that was written to Horace Greeley. It's often used to show that Lincoln was intolerant or didn't want to really get rid of slavery. He was just using it as a military necessity. It's written in 1862, which is just around the time of the Emancipation Proclamation. He writes this letter to Horace Greeley, and it's often used to attack Lincoln because he says up here that he would save the constitutional government whatever way he could. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I'd do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would do that. But again, you have to read the whole source, because down here at the bottom it says, I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty. That means as president. And I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. Those wishes are seen as early as the 1850s when he's having his debates with Stephen Douglas. Lincoln displayed his political skill with handling the Emancipation. Initially, he didn't free the slaves because it would undermine that unity that they were hoping for with the North. He was afraid of antagonizing the border states that allowed slavery. When the deep southern states decided to secede in 1860 along with South Carolina, a number of southern states decided not to secede, and we call them border states. They were slave states that stayed loyal to the Union. And it's these border states here that initially stayed loyal. In fact, in Virginia, the first time secession was put up to a vote, they refused to leave. It's not until after the battle at Fort Sumter that these southern border states, these territories here, decided to leave. Again, this opens up Lincoln to charges of hypocrisy and racism. However, he would answer that a president is responsible to his office, not just his personal whims. So, Lincoln decides to issue the Emancipation Proclamation in order to, not just as a military measure, but it is a military measure, in order to help win the war. Not for obvious reasons of depriving the South of labor, though. The Confederacy wouldn't have recognized Lincoln's authority, so they wouldn't have followed his directive. So there's no way that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued simply as a way to hurt the South. The South wouldn't have followed the Emancipation anyways. Some slaves were freed as the Union Army swept through the South, but not because of the Emancipation Proclamation. They were liberated because they felt liberated, and they ran to the Union camps. They essentially freed themselves. The Emancipation Proclamation is a military move because it's a foreign policy move. The Emancipation Proclamation added liberating slaves to the goals of preserving the Union. So now the Civil War is fought over two reasons. One, preserve the Union, and two, free the slaves. Why is this a foreign policy move? Because the British were debating whether or not to ally themselves with the Confederates. The British had freed all their slaves back in 1834. It's a whole generation earlier. And the people of Britain, the working class, were rabidly abolitionist. The Confederates were using the American Revolution playbook. They were prolonging the war until the British allied with the Confederacy. But the British were strongly opposed to slavery, which means by making this a war about slavery, the abolitionist British would not support a country that based its existence on supporting a slave system. Again, opening himself up to charges of racism by a modern observer, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in the fall and allowed the Confederates a chance to surrender. Actually gave them 100 days to surrender and still allow them to keep their slaves. This is a genius move by him, politically. The Confederates would never take the deal. We're 2 years into the Civil War. They figured they might as well just keep going with the war. And and Lincoln knew this, and it made him look reasonable to the British. Lincoln could go to the British and say, hey, I tried. I told them they could keep their slaves if they wanted to come back, but this is a war about slavery to them. They want to be able to keep their slaves, and they just want to fight. So the Emancipation Proclamation only freed those states that were still in rebellion. The Union border states got to keep their slaves, again, opening up Lincoln to charges of racism, but he could not afford to let those border states join the Confederacy. They were very important to him. Southern states didn't recognize Lincoln's authority to emancipate anyways, so the Emancipation Proclamation, a little trivia for you, originally freed 0 slaves when it went into effect. As the slaves learned of the Emancipation Proclamation, they tended to take matters into their own hands, though, and they ran to the Union lines for freedom. Slaves were freed as their homes were captured by the Union forces. We can see in this stereoscope picture that what was called the slave pens, which were liberated by Union forces. The Emancipation Proclamation was a wartime executive order. This made Lincoln nervous because he wanted to make sure that the emancipation would stick. So as the war was winding down, he started pushing for the 13th Amendment because he worried that as the war ended, that wartime executive order would be overturned by the Supreme Court or Congress as the Union was being cobbled back together. He pushed for the 13th Amendment, which would outlaw slavery according to the Constitution. The Emancipation Proclamation also allowed African Americans to enlist in the U.S. military, the Union Army at the time. Most notably is the 54th Massachusetts, who served with distinction at Fort Wagner, showing that African Americans could serve with distinction. This disproved myths about their race. People thought that they would be weak, they'd run away from the battle, but they showed that they were willing to take heavy casualties, upward in the neighborhood of 75% casualties in order to take this fort. We see here the picture. This is what the movie Glory is all about, by the way, if you've ever seen that. Unfortunately, African Americans were still forced to serve in segregated units under white officers. They typically had less pay and worse supplies, but now they were at least able to fight for their freedom. This also leads me to another issue dealing with sourcing. Be careful of the myth of the Black Confederates. There's no primary source evidence that suggests that African Americans served in the Confederate Army. There's some that suggest that African Americans were forced to participate in sort of work gangs, doing behind the work scenes, digging trenches, cleaning up bodies, that sort of thing, but none were actually given rifles to fight the Union. What information we do have is dubious. For example, this picture here you can find on the internet is apparently a 1st Louisiana Native Guard picture taken in 1861. It's completely falsified. It's a cropped version of this picture, which is a Union picture from Philadelphia. And think about it, why would a troop in Louisiana be issued winter gear? So what happens is people want to proclaim this myth of the Confederate black soldier. They want to make it seem like the war wasn't about slavery, and they promote this myth, and they try to make a nice chunk of change off it too by selling uncritical eyes these posters. And that's going to lead us into theme 3, where we talk about a quick timeline of the events.